What will happen if the Emperor finally dies? It's the question that hangs over every piece of Warhammer 40K lore. The Emperor of Mankind, the most powerful psychic being humanity has ever produced, has been sitting on the Golden Throne for over 10,000 years. His body is a rotting husk kept alive by ancient technology that nobody fully understands. So the question isn't really if the Emperor dies, it's when and what happens next. But here's the thing. The Emperor dying isn't one scenario, it's at least two very different ones with very different consequences. Because the Emperor isn't just a body on a chair, he's a psychic presence so powerful that the Chaos Gods themselves call him the Anathema. His physical form and his psychic essence are doing different things, and what happens depends entirely on which parts stop working. So let's break this down. Let's start with what the Emperor actually does right now, because most people only know half of it. He does three critical things simultaneously. First, he powers and directs the Astronomicon, the psychic lighthouse that makes faster than light warp travel possible. The Astronomicon is projected from a chamber beneath the hollow mountain in the Himalayan range on Terra. 10,000 specially selected psychers called the Chosen channel their life force through it, burning out and dying at a rate of up to 1,000 per day. But the raw power they generate is useless without the Emperor's mind to focus and direct it into a coherent beam. That beam reaches roughly 50,000 light years across the galaxy. Without it, ships can only make tiny blind jumps of about 4 to 5 light years at a time using basic cogitator calculations. The Imperium spans the better part of the Milky Way. You can do the math on how long it would take to cross that without a beacon. Second, he holds shut a breach in the webway, an ancient network of tunnels through an alternate dimension originally built by the Eldar. See, the Emperor's grand plan before everything went wrong was to give humanity access to the webway. No more dangerous warp travel, no more feeding psychers to demons. He built the Golden Throne partly as a gateway into the webway and started constructing a human extension of the network. Then, during the Horus Heresy, Magnus the Red, trying to warn his father about Horus's betrayal, used sorcery to punch a psychic message through the webway's walls. He shattered the protective barriers. This ripped open a permanent doorway between Terra and the warp right underneath the Imperial Palace. Demons poured through. The Emperor is using part of his power just to hold shut the breach with his mind. He's been doing it for 10,000 years. If he stops, demons flood directly into the throne room and across Terra. Third, and this is the one people argue about, he acts as a psychic ward against chaos itself. His presence in the warp disrupts demonic activity, empowers the faithful through what people call miracles, and generally makes it harder for the Chaos Gods to do whatever they want. In the novel Godblight, he literally reached through Roboute Guilliman's body to banish the Daemon Primarch Mortarion and scorched a chunk of Nurgle's own garden in the warp. The Plague God himself felt it. That's not a passive corpse on life support. That's something actively fighting back against gods. So with that context, let's talk about the two scenarios. Scenario 1. The Emperor's body dies, but his psychic energy persists. This is the more optimistic scenario, and it's the one a lot of the current lore seems to be hinting at. The idea is simple. The Emperor's physical form finally gives out. The Golden Throne stops sustaining his body, but his psychic essence, which has been growing in the warp for 10,000 years, fueled by the faith of trillions, continues to exist. Maybe it even gets stronger. Maybe it becomes something entirely new. There's real canonical support for this. The Star Child theory, which goes back to some of the earliest 40K lore, suggests the Emperor planted the seed of his own reincarnation in the warp after his battle with Horus. The Emperor was originally born from the collective sacrifice of thousands of prehistoric shamans who pooled their souls into a single being. He inherited their ability to reincarnate, but that reincarnation can't happen while he's still tethered to the Golden Throne, no matter how tenuously. The Horus Heresy novel The End and the Death by Dan Abnett reveals that during his final confrontation with Horus, the Emperor cast off a fragment of his soul containing almost all of his hope, loyalty, and compassion into the warp. That fragment has been drifting and growing out there ever since, accumulating power from belief and emotion, just like the Chaos Gods themselves grow. And the events of Godblight suggest the Emperor's psychic presence is already more powerful than it was during the Great Crusade. The militant apostolic Matthew came to believe that the Great Rift itself was empowering the Emperor, that he was close to reawakening. Belisarius Cawl, the greatest living tech priest, suspects the Emperor is changing his fundamental nature. But here's the problem. Even in this best-case scenario, the moment his body dies on the throne, several catastrophic things happen simultaneously. First, the webway breach under the Imperial Palace rips wide open. Demons flood into Terra. And not just any part of Terra, the heart of the Imperial Palace, humanity's most sacred ground, the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's personal golden armored bodyguard, and the Sisters of Silence psychic nullifying warrior women would be fighting for their lives within minutes. These are some of the most elite warriors in the Imperium, but against a potentially unlimited tide of demons pouring through a gate large enough for a Titan to walk through, they can only hold so long. Second, the Talisman of Seven Hammers activates. This is a doomsday device built by the Primarch Vulcan on the Emperor's own orders during the Siege of Terra. Vulcan, the master craftsman and one of the few Primarchs the Emperor truly trusted with this burden, was horrified when he learned what the Emperor wanted him to build. But the Emperor chose Vulcan specifically because he was the most reluctant to use such a weapon, the most humane of the Primarchs. The talisman is installed directly into the Golden Throne as a dead man's switch. If the throne fails, the talisman ignites and burns Terra to its core, the entire planet. Gone. The Sol system devastated. This wasn't a backup plan, it was a denial strategy. If humanity can't have Terra, nobody can. The Emperor himself ordered its creation because he understood that a demon-controlled Terra, with all of its symbolic and psychic significance, would be worse than no Terra at all. So even if the Emperor's psychic essence survives and ascends, Terra is destroyed. The Imperial Palace, the Administratum, the High Lords, the massive bureaucratic infrastructure that coordinates a million worlds, the vaults of ancient technology, 10,000 years of accumulated records and relics, all of it vaporized. That's the immediate short-term consequence, the political heart of humanity obliterated in a single moment. Now, can the Imperium survive this? Maybe, and the main reason is one man. Roboute Guilliman, the returned Primarch, has already been running the Imperium's military and political apparatus since his resurrection. He launched the Indomitus Crusade, the largest military mobilization since the Great Crusade itself. He appointed Commander Dante of the Blood Angels as regent of the Imperium Nihilus, the dark half of the Imperium, already cut off from the Astronomicon by the Great Rift. He's been reforming the administrative structures, rooting out corruption, and preparing the Imperium for exactly the kind of crisis that's coming. He even once created a contingency empire called Imperium Secundus during the Horus Heresy, when it looked like Terra would fall. He's done this before. Here's the key question though. Does the Astronomicon survive in this scenario? If the Emperor's psychic essence persists in the warp, it's possible he could continue directing the Astronomicon's beam from the immaterial side. Before the heresy, the Emperor powered the Astronomicon from wherever he happened to be. He only sat on the throne to manage the Webway project. If his reborn or ascended psychic form can still project the beacon, then long-range warp travel continues even without the physical infrastructure on Terra. The Imperium loses its capital but keeps its nervous system. That's survivable. In the long term, this scenario could actually improve things for the Imperium. a fully awakened emperor unshackled from the Golden Throne, existing as a true warp entity opposing the Chaos Gods directly. That's potentially the most powerful weapon humanity has ever had. Living saints like Saint Celestine would multiply. By the way, a tangent, why the heck would we need female custodians? Games Workshop, just look at Celestine and pop out more of these amazing badass female characters. Anyway, moving on. The Emperor body dying would mean miracles would become even more commonplace than in the current setting. The faith of the ecclesiarchy wouldn't just be superstition anymore. It would be a direct psychic link to a god that actually answers back. Space Marines would fight with renewed purpose, knowing their creator walks among the stars again in some form. But there's a dark side even here. Guilliman himself worried about this in the Dark Imperium novels. When Guilliman stood before the Golden Throne and communed with his father after being resurrected, he was deeply disturbed by what he sensed. He felt no warmth, no fatherly recognition, just a cold, overwhelming intelligence that saw him as a tool, not a son. What's waking up in the warp might not be the benevolent father figure the Imperium worships. 10 millennia of agony, isolation, and the worship of trillions might have created something terrifying. Call suspects the Emperor is changing his nature. Guilliman fears that whatever is emerging isn't the glorious leader he remembers, but something insane and alien, more like the Chaos Gods than anyone would be comfortable admitting, just pointed in a different direction. There are whispers in the lore about an intellect rising in the warp that even the Chaos Pantheon cannot compete with. That's simultaneously the most hopeful and the most terrifying sentence in all of 40K. Short-term verdict for Scenario 1. Catastrophic. Terra burns. Billions die. The Imperium fractures severely and enters a period of terrible crisis. Long-term verdict. Potentially survivable, maybe even an improvement if the Emperor's psychic essence remains coherent and continues to power the Astronomicon. But what comes back might be as frightening as what was lost. Scenario 2. The Emperor dies completely, body and soul. This is the nightmare scenario. The Emperor's physical form fails, and his psychic essence disperses or is consumed by the 4 Chaos Gods. No reincarnation, no Star Child, no ascension. Just gone. The anathema, the one being in the galaxy that made Chaos genuinely afraid, snuffed out forever. Everything from Scenario 1 happens first. The webway breach opens, the Talisman of 7 Hammers fires, Terra burns, but now add the worst consequence possible. The Astronomicon goes dark. Permanently. See, the Astronomicon isn't just a machine, it's 10,000 psychers channeling their life force through a device that's directed by the Emperor's mind. Without the Emperor, those psychers are just screaming into the void with no guiding intelligence to shape their power into a coherent signal. The light goes out and every navigator on every Imperial ship in the galaxy is suddenly blind. We already know exactly what this looks like because it already happened to half the Imperium when the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, tore across the galaxy. It blocked the Astronomicon's light from reaching the Imperium Nihilus. The result was immediate galaxy-scale catastrophe. The period called the Noctis Eterna, the Blackness, saw worlds cut off from each other completely. Warp travel became nearly impossible. Chaos fleets and warbands raided with impunity. Demon worlds formed overnight as the barrier between reality and the warp grew thin. Billions of people died before anyone could even begin to mount a coordinated response. Commander Dante and the Blood Angels were nearly annihilated by Hive Fleet Leviathan during the devastation of Baal because no reinforcements could reach them. Many isolated Imperial worlds in the Imperium Nihilus genuinely believed they were the last outpost of humanity left alive, and that was just half the Imperium losing the light, with the other half still functioning. Now imagine the entire galaxy plunged into permanent darkness. Without the Astronomicon, Imperial ships are limited to short calculated jumps of 4 to 5 light years. The Imperium spans tens of thousands of light years, trade stops, military reinforcements, can't reach besieged worlds in any reasonable time frame. Hive worlds that depend on food imports from agri-worlds start starving within months. These are worlds with populations in the hundreds of billions packed into massive city structures that produce nothing edible. Forge worlds that supply ammunition, weapons, and equipment to war zones go silent. Communication via astropaths becomes erratic and unreliable without the Emperor's stabilizing psychic presence. Every world becomes an island. This is the second age of strife. The first one lasted 5,000 years and nearly exterminated humanity entirely. The Emperor ended it by unifying Terra, building the Astronomicon, and launching the Great Crusade. But there's no Emperor this time. There's no one with the psychic power to light a new beacon. Guilliman would still be alive, assuming he's not on Terra when it burns. And he would try. He'd probably fall back to Ultramar, his personal domain of roughly 500 worlds that he's been fortifying and reforming into a model of efficient governance. Ultramar could become the seed of a smaller successor state, but the threats facing this remnant would be endless. The Chaos Gods, unrestrained by the anathema's psychic opposition, would launch incursions on an unprecedented scale. Without the Emperor's ward, every latent psyker becomes a potential gateway for demonic possession, and the number of psykers being born is already skyrocketing due to the psychic awakening triggered by the Great Rift. The Tyranid hive fleets are still descending on the galaxy. Necron tomb worlds keep waking up. Orcs grow unchecked without the Imperial Guard able to mobilize against them. Some factions might survive independently. The Adeptus Mechanicus on Mars has its own resources and military forces. Space Marine chapters are self-sufficient fortress monasteries. The Leagues of Votan don't rely on the Astronomicon for warp travel at all. But the broader human civilization, the trillion-soul hive worlds, the Imperial Guard, the Tithe system, the Ecclesiarchy, all of it collapses without reliable warp travel connecting it together. And there's one more horrifying possibility. A secretive group called the Illuminati, who studied the Emperor's nature using knowledge from the Eldar's Black Library, believed that if the Emperor died completely, his psychic death scream could birth a fifth chaos god from humanity's collective anguish. The precedent exists. The Eldar's psychic excess birthed Slaanesh and tore open the Eye of Terror. Humanity is far more numerous than the Eldar ever were. The psychic backlash of quadrillions of souls simultaneously losing their god could tear open something even worse, centered on the Sol system, or spanning the entire galaxy. Short-term verdict for Scenario 2. Apocalyptic, Terra destroyed, Astronomicon extinguished, galaxy-wide collapse of everything, billions die in the first weeks alone. Long-term verdict. The Imperium as a unified million-world empire is finished. Fragments survive, but human galactic dominance is over. Humanity regresses into isolated pockets fighting for survival, exactly like the Age of Strife. Except this time, the enemies are stronger, more numerous, better organized, and there's no emperor coming to fix it. So which scenario is more likely? The current lore leans heavily toward Scenario 1. The Emperor's psychic presence has been growing, not fading. His interventions through Guilliman, through saints, through miracles that defy the plague god himself, all suggest he's evolving into something new and powerful. The End and the Death and Godblight both hint strongly at an Emperor ascending beyond his mortal limitations. But here's the thing that makes 40K what it is. Even the hopeful scenario is horrifying. Even if the Emperor transcends, Terra still burns. The political infrastructure still collapses. Whatever godlike entity emerges from the warp might be powerful enough to fight the Chaos Gods directly, but it might also be utterly alien to the humanity it's supposed to protect. A god born from 10,000 years of suffering and sustained by the desperate worship of trillions isn't necessarily a kind god. The grimdark truth is this: the Emperor can't stay on the throne forever. The Golden Throne is failing and no one alive can fix it. Sooner or later, the clock runs out. And when it does, the Imperium of Man, The largest human civilization in history, spanning 1,000,000 worlds and quadrillions of souls, faces either a traumatic rebirth or total extinction. There's no scenario where things just keep going as they are. There's no version of this that isn't drenched in blood. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is little hope.